This week, we'll look at the stories and trends that made headlines in 2022, from conflict in Eastern Europe and East Africa to a global economic downturn and a shifting geopolitical landscape. In some cases, it was the end of an era. In other places, it was the beginning of a new one. How did the developments of 2022 shape the relationship between people and power, between Africa, the West, and the rest of the world? We'll have in-depth reporting and analysis of the year's highs and lows. Straight Talk Africa starts now. Hello there and welcome to the show. I'm Haydé Adams. It is so great to be with you. We're taking a look back at some of the biggest stories we covered here at the Voice of America in 2022. The highs and lows of a year that began with war in Eastern Europe, bringing with it far-reaching economic and political consequences. Here in Washington, Russia's invasion of Ukraine brought a renewed focus on geopolitical relations and a potential new world order. At the same time, it put U.S. domestic and foreign policies under the spotlight. Now, for more on what 2022 was like for the Biden-Harris administration, we go now to VOA's White House Bureau Chief, Patsy Widakuswara. She's had a front row seat to many of the challenges that confronted President Joe Biden. Patsy, so great to see you. Please tell us, how did the war in Ukraine really shape the Biden-Harris administration's foreign policy agenda?
The war in Ukraine has impacted American foreign policy in at least two ways. One, it has detracted from the major foreign policy theme, which is strategic rivalry with China. It has taken away resources, it has taken away focus. Second, it has highlighted for the Biden administration the divide between the West and the rest. As the Biden administration leads a coalition to isolate Russia, it's beginning to understand that outside of Europe, many countries, including countries in the African continent, depend on Russia for oil, for weapons, as well as for food. As we know, access to Ukrainian grains is something that a lot of African countries really depend on. And so this is something that the Biden administration has to focus on as it tries to expand alliances and partnership to continue to do this effort of helping Ukraine and isolate Russia.
Now, Patsy, President Biden has had a pile of legislative priorities at home. How much of those things did he get done, and how much did he not get done?
The political analysts that I've spoken to say that they give Joe Biden at least a B+ for his legislative wins because he has done a lot. The semiconductor research and manufacturing, a large package, as well as military aid to Ukraine, as well as issue support for social safety net, and also the reauthorization of the violence against women. These are all bills that got passed. However, he didn't get everything that he wanted, so there's definitely a lot more that needs to be done in 2023.
Well, Patsy Widakuswara, thank you so much. Patsy is VOA's White House Bureau Chief here in Washington. Well, we're going to move on to the next section of our show. Of course, 2022 saw the world gripped by an economic crisis in the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic and exacerbated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which sent energy prices soaring. Henry Ridgewell reports.
Obeng Krampa imports second-hand furniture to sell in his home city of Accra. But he's struggling to balance the books. Inflation in Ghana has hit 40% this year, and the currency has almost halved in value against the US dollar.
The amount you use to import, let's say, one container, these days you have to double the amount. The same goods, the same quantity, but the amount has been doubled.
Across the world, central banks have imposed sharp rate rises to try to tame inflation driven by soaring energy costs. The US Federal Reserve raised interest rates 6 times in 2022, strengthening the dollar.
People buy goods, they sell goods, but there is a difference in time between them. If during that time the currency changes, the manufacturer or the buyer can lose money. And all this, remember, is also tied to inflation. And not just inflation, but expectations of inflation. So how, if I'm selling burgers How much should I price them now? Or should I keep changing the price every day?
The uncertainty has hit the world economy, forecast to grow just 2.2% in 2023, down from over 5% last year.
Rising global interest rates are increasing the cost of borrowing, putting many households, firms and governments under increased pressure. Russia's war against Ukraine has also worsened the conditions for low-income countries. Many of them are particularly vulnerable to high food and energy prices, and in addition, tighter global financial conditions raise the risk of further debt distress in those countries.
That distress is felt acutely in Sri Lanka, which is suffering its worst financial crisis since independence in 1948. The government defaulted on its debts in May as inflation hit 70%.
We can't afford to buy chicken, fish, or any other meat. We only eat vegetables and leaves. It is difficult for us to even send our children to schools and even provide them proper meals. We are going through a very hard time.
Across the world, workers are demanding better pay as inflation eats into their wages. In Britain, nurses and ambulance workers are set to stage strikes in December.
I've had to cut down on a lot of things with the kids, which I can't afford to provide for them because of the high cost of living.
Inflation is forecast to fall back slightly in 2023. But with the war in Ukraine still raging and energy prices high, the new year will bring little relief for the billions of people struggling to get by. Henry Ridgewell for VOA News, London.
Well, joining me now to discuss the people and the moments that shaped the news in 2022 is Vincent Makori. He's the TV managing editor in VOA's English to Africa news service. And also with us, Calvin Dark. He's an international political commentator and the co-founder of RC Communications. Vincent and Calvin, it's so great to have you both here. Let's buckle up. We're going to whiz through the events of 2022. But as that story we just saw, inflation, that was probably the one thing that affected every single nation, every household, non-wealthy household, I would say, in the world. The single biggest knock-on effect from Russia's war in Ukraine.
Most definitely. In fact, like if you look across the continent of Africa and many economies, many had not realized the extent to which they relied on grain and maize and oil, cooking oil from Ukraine. And when this war began, suddenly people were not able to afford food. Of course, prices soared, especially, because of the high prices of or shortages of oil. There was high prices even in transportation costs. And so this impacted people in so many different ways, in profound ways that in fact ended up in some cases crippling businesses and had some far-reaching implications when it came even to the political sphere, especially around election time for those countries that went through elections.
Calvin, I mean, it's so interesting that we were once again caught off guard by the knock-on effects from the war in Ukraine, especially coming out of the pandemic. What did this reveal about our economies, especially those in Africa?
Well, I think that, there's an old saying that when America gets a cold, the rest of the world gets the flu. And unfortunately, that usually means a lot of countries in Africa. And I think in the United States, we've been really insulated from the effects of a global economy. Now people are feeling it, but I kind of want to remind people that there's been an inflation problem and some economic insecurity in a lot of African countries for decades that are for systemic problems. And the current moment we've been living in just exacerbated that. So I think that while it has affected the world, unfortunately, it affected countries that were already dealing with inflation that no one was paying attention to like they should.
Vincent, the war in Ukraine, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, also really gave us an opportunity to see the extent of Russia's influence in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa, particularly in certain parts of Africa, didn't it?
Yes, we got to see, for example, the influence that Russia has exerted in the western northern part of Africa. We saw Russia, being involved in driving away French forces from the Sahel region. And so many had not paid attention to Russia's involvement with African countries, especially on the security area, because most people are looking at big infrastructure from China. They see China written all over. But what's happening is that Russia has been working so hard to have influence in African countries, and we kind of got to see that, especially when it came to voting, or at least taking sides with that war. Many were surprised to see African countries actually and not willing to oppose Russia's war in Ukraine. And that kind of a situation confused many, but the reality is that Russia has been developing relationships with African countries for quite some time now.
Calvin, it also laid bare two things, of course, put renewed attention on the security situation in West Africa, of course, and Russia's role in many of those places. At the same time, it also laid bare geopolitical tensions that we may not have been paying attention to, and that affected African countries, the United States, European countries, and Russia.
It did. And, when we talk about like the Wagner Group, which every time I hear it, I'm thinking about a group on K Street or something that's influential. And in some ways, it is obviously on the military front, but it shows that Russia is not only trying to influence militarily, but also politically. And a lot of the decisions that are being made in the countries where Russia and the Wagner Group are influential will affect how they interact with the United States. One thing that I just want to keep in mind when it comes to Russia and the war in Ukraine and African countries is one of the things we say in North Carolina is you know where your bread is buttered, okay? And I think that African countries have had to be more savvy to realize that it may make a good line in a UN speech to say we stand with the US, NATO in this or that, but if from Russia or China, is the US or the NATO allies going to fill in those gaps? For food insecurity, for weapons, for all of this support. History says it's not quite sure. I think that's why the recent summit was great. Biden made those promises, but I think that's an interesting position that African countries have been put into. They have to know where their bread is buttered and who will be there for them when they are in need, like Ukraine is in need.
Vincent, still speaking a little bit to some of what Calvin was saying, it also shone the light on, again, this instability we see in West Africa. We also saw continuation of the cycle of coups in places like Mali, Burkina Faso.
Yeah, one of the latest was Burkina Faso. We saw coups even the year before. But what that has shown is that some parts of Africa are yet to really entrench democratic systems. They still suffer from, weak institutions and therefore making them vulnerable. And so when you have this external influence, it does destabilize regions. And therefore, because there are these external forces, including Russia, trying to influence what's going on in those countries, then we end up with the situation like we've seen in those countries where there are coups. And now this is like a sound from the 80s and an echo from the past that people don't want to hear. But the reality that we have seen now is that there are many countries that are still vulnerable. And unless, of course, certain things change, we continue seeing this external interference in the local kind of political developments in some of these countries.
Calvin, just briefly, the U.S. midterm elections, I want to bring things back here to the United States. What did the outcome of the U.S. midterm elections we saw in November, what did that mean for U.S. foreign policy, especially towards Africa?
I think it's going to be very simple. I think between now and January 2025, any policy, support, influence that the United States can have, they will have through the Biden administration as long as it doesn't cost anything. Because one of the things that we know here is the president controls foreign policy, but the House of Representatives, to be controlled by the Republicans, controls the purse strings, the money. And we already know that prominent Republicans have expressed doubt about spending money outside of our country, and namely Ukraine. So if they're questioning that, Africa is far down on the list of priorities. So I think that we will get shows of support But when it comes to funding and money, that's not going to happen while the Republicans are in charge of the House of Representatives.
So despite the promises President Biden made at the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, how much of that will he have to walk back, and how much of that can he actually act on?
Well, I think there's a lot that he can do that doesn't cost money. Attention, a lot of the, his call for inclusion in the G20 with the African Union, a permanent seat for an African country at the Security Council and UN. Attention, that's something that doesn't cost Congress any money, that's valuable. But some of the monetary commitments, we have to be realistic that that's not going to happen. One, given Republicans in charge of Congress, but two, America's own economic situation here domestically.
And on that note, Vincent and Calvin, do stay with me after the break. We'll take a look at the Ethiopia-Tigray peace treaty, the end of an era in Angola and the United Kingdom, and the beginning of new ones in Kenya and Somalia, as well as that sensational FIFA World Cup in Qatar. All of that when Straight Talk Africa returns.
From around the world, let's go.
You're with Straight Talk Africa. Welcome back. We're talking about the highs and lows of 2022 and the people and events that shaped the news. In November, warring sides in the deadly conflict that has been raging in Ethiopia's northern Tigray region signed a peace deal. Now there are questions surrounding whether that peace deal will be honored, even as civilians on both sides of the conflict cry out for justice after suffering possible war crimes. Henry Wilkins takes a look.
2020's Axum massacre saw Eritrean and Ethiopian troops carry out extrajudicial executions against civilians, indiscriminate shelling and widespread looting in the city in northern Tigray. Residents estimate hundreds were killed. Hiab Gebrusadik is a survivor.
The federal government is actually the perpetrator of the crime, and the criminals cannot investigate their own crime. Justice should come from free international organizations like the UN, the EU, the African Union.
Like many in Ethiopia, he wants justice for the suffering that he and his community endured during the country's 2-year conflict. A peace deal was signed in South Africa in early November, and an end to the war may be in sight, but grievances stemming from possible war crimes remain. In September, a UN Commission of Inquiry on Ethiopia said starvation of civilians in Tigray was used by the government as a method of warfare, and that Ethiopian and Eritrean forces used sexual slavery against Tigrayan women and girls. Tigrayan forces, the UN said, didn't use the tactics but were accused of war crimes, including rape in areas they occupied in the Amhara and Afar regions. This woman from Lalibela, who asked to remain anonymous out of fear, says she was 7 months pregnant when Tigrayan soldiers came to her house and raped her.
They took me to a deserted area and raped me. They held me with them from Monday to Saturday. There was no administration, no police, and everyone left. It is only those of us who were helpless and weak. And as I said, I was pregnant and my mother is blind.
Although both sides have committed atrocities, the group Human Rights Watch says it has documented a sustained campaign of ethnic cleansing against Tigrayans, much of which has taken place in darkness because media and human rights investigators could not gain access to the Tigray region. And since the peace deal, the amount of aid being allowed to enter Tigray
is not enough to meet the enormous needs there. And at the same time, the services, be it communications, electricity, banking, which are so critical to meeting the needs of the population as well, have not been restored by the federal government authorities. So we really are talking about a context in which abuses are ongoing.
Asked whether the deal is being implemented fast enough, one analyst told VOA,
it's not entirely clear how much progress has been made in sort of deconflicting the front lines, this disengagement process. Again, this doesn't mean that the deal is about to collapse. It just demonstrates how hard this process is.
Even if a lasting peace is established, the road to accountability and reconciliation will be long. Tigrayan leaders have repeatedly said they wish to hold a referendum to leave the Ethiopian Federation. Henry Wilkins for VOA News.
Great reporting there by Henry Wilkins. My guests are VOA's Vincent Makori and international political commentator Calvin Dark. And Vincent, this is by no means a peace deal, is by no means the end to the Ethiopia-Tigray issue. But what does it say about the African Union's ability to, quote, bring African solutions to African problems and to actually be an honest broker in these types of conflicts on the continent?
You see, that has been the quest for most, across the continent. Why is the African Union unable to really, broker peace amongst themselves, between African nations, even internal conflicts? So this was a demonstration of the ability to do that if there is a commitment. There has never been seen to be any reason why the African leaders cannot sit together and actually bring warring parties together and talk about peace and enforce that, because there are mechanisms for that. The African Union has the security organs and the peace organs and all. So this was a positive step. At least it's an encouraging move. And so while it's not a peace deal per se, it is a commitment to cessation of fighting, and it's hoped that as they continue talking, especially in Nairobi, they can eventually end up having a total peace agreement that can bring peace to the area and save lives. People have been dying not only from the war but also from the effects of that war, including food shortages and lack of medication.
And why not? I mean, the irony here is that this is a war happening in the same country where the African Union is headquartered, of course. Calvin, what's your take? Does the AU get credit for this?
Yes, and I hope that it's not the exception, but that it's the rule. It is the first step in really getting confidence in the African Union that they can be a force to really change, to address conflicts, to resolve issues. I think kind of the call now is, okay, do this one, fill in the blank with this conflict or this country. That remains to be seen, but this is so incredibly powerful. It shows the potential that the African Union can have in Africa. And then guess what? That's more influence the African Union and African countries have in international bodies if they can show that this is not just a one-off, but it's something that can happen on multiple fronts in multiple countries.
I want to turn to that crucial election in Kenya and, of course, the other election in Angola. There was real concern about the potential for political violence, for the losing side to not accept the results of the election. But, power changed hands in one case, power did not change hands in the other. But there was no deadly violence that people were expecting. What does that say about how much progress we have made on this score in many parts of the continent?
If I may speak about the Kenyan election first, because I was there, my personal prediction, expectation was that there would be peace. The election results may be disputed, but people will not go to any form of, violent eruption. And that is because, not just because of the leadership, but actually people are fatigued. They have no appetite for violence because they've realized over time that it only hurts them. It has nothing to do with the leadership. But of course there were calls for peace, and that also seemed to have worked. So it was encouraging to see that, and it looks like that is now a thing of the past, at least in Kenya. People have no interest in engaging in violence just because of an election. Going down south in Angola was also the same thing. Initially, of course, the MPLA looked like, it was not very comfortable with the election results. But eventually the results come in. The UNITA got 49%, and PLA got 51%. The election results were accepted, and also, although maybe grudgingly, but the truth is that it looks like the people of Africa themselves, the voters, are saying we are not going to engage in violence because of an election. We know we finish this process and move on, and if you have some some issues with it. We'll see how best we can deal with them.
Calvin, also in Angola, we saw the death of Eduardo dos Santos, the former president there and liberation leader. As Angolans reflected on his life and his legacy, what did that say to you too also about the MPLA itself as a liberation movement, one of many in Southern Africa? Were there any messages that came out for the rest of Africa about sort of the longevity of liberation movements?
Well, I think that what we're seeing across Africa, particularly Southern Africa, when it comes to liberation movements, is there's so much respect for them. There's so much history behind them. But does their political agenda and the way that they seek to affect change match with 2022 and beyond? And I think that one of the things that you have to realize is with Africa's population being so young, we're now at a place where the decision makers at the voting booths read about this. They didn't live through it. And so while there still may be that respect, I think they're now asking questions because a lot of the liberation movements that have so much respect, we're dealing with corruption. We're dealing with transition of power, peaceful transitions of power. And what does that exactly mean? So I think we're getting the sense of, it doesn't mean they're going away, but that they have to change because we're in a new environment, a new world with new people that look at the liberation movements differently.
Absolutely. Speaking of another end of an era, the death of Queen Elizabeth really made African countries reflect on her life and her legacy, especially on the continent, and how Africa wants to engage with the United Kingdom going forward, Vincent.
Yes, many have this, love for the monarchy, but for some it was a time to reflect on the relationship between Britain and the continent. So there was a kind of you saw mixed feelings, mixed reactions. Some of them saw the Queen as a symbol of oppression, given the historical past of the continent of colonialism and oppression and so on and so forth. And so there's been a lot of kind of soul searching as to how does the continent continue in its relationship with the British Empire, if you may call it so.
Gentlemen, I really hoped we could get to a few other points here, but I'm hearing we are running out of time. But I do want to thank you so very much for coming in and talking to me. There will always be other opportunities to talk about these things again in future. Thank you so much, Calvin Dark, Vincent Makori. I really appreciate it. And that is how we wrap things up for this week and for 2022. Thank you so much to all my wonderful guests, to my colleagues, and to our affiliates for airing the show across the African continent. And a big thank you to you for joining us on television, radio, and online. It was great to be with you this year. From all of us here on Straight Talk Africa, we wish you a happy and prosperous 2023. We leave you now with a look at the year in photos. Go well. Goodbye.
Yeah!